On the evening of February 11, 1862, Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant holds a council of war meeting with his generals, all but one of whom support his plans for an overland attack on Fort Donelson. The only general who objects with reservations about the plan is Brigadier General John A. McClernand. The next day, Grant's expeditionary command begins moving out from its staging area at the recently subjugated Fort Henry, marching east overland towards Fort Donelson. Meanwhile, Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote begins maneuvering his western flotilla into the Cumberland River for a naval bombardment of the Confederate fort. However, unlike Fort Henry, Donelson will prove to be a tough nut for the Federals to crack. The Union columns begin marching via the Ridge and Telegraph roads on the morning of February 12th, now occupied by mild weather and quickly drying roads. Brigadier Generals McClernand and Smith sets out with their commands, leaving Brigadier General Lew Wallace and 2,500 men to guard the Federal base at Fort Henry. The way to Fort Donelson in the nearby town of Dover lay over steep hills and deep ravines, but an air of gaiety pervades the march as it seems like a picture book war in Dixie. Soldiers ditch their excess overcoats and blankets. Nowhere do the Confederates seem to impede the Union troops' advance. At the same time that Grant is marching his command overland, Foote and his gunboats are escorting troop transports carrying reinforcements up the Cumberland. The USS Carondelet precedes the waterborne column with orders to announce its arrival to Grant by firing a few shells at Fort Donelson. By the evening of the 12th, Grant's land force has moved virtually unopposed to the outskirts of Confederate positions surrounding Dover. Suddenly, General McClernand's cavalry patrols run into resistance about a mile from the rebel defenses, when troopers under the rugged but as yet unsung Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest sets up a roadblock. Arrival of Union infantry soon forces the gray-clad horsemen back into the Confederate perimeter. Remembering Pelow's ineptitude during the Mexican War, Grant had boasted that he would march to Fort Donelson unopposed. The Tennessee politician turned general was absent at the moment, having gone to Cumberland City to argue with Brigadier General John B. Floyd for standing firm at the fort. But he had left Brigadier General Simon B. Buckner in charge with orders to avoid pitched battle. The Kentuckian does so, and the Union besiegers arrive without much difficulty. Slowly, Generals Smith and McClernand take up positions to carry out Grant's plan. They will surround the fort and wait for Foote and his gunboats to repeat their easy victory at Fort Henry. The Union Navy could batter the Confederates into submission. In General Grant's view, this will save time and lives. As the Army commander and his staff set up headquarters at the Widow Crisp's cabin on a slope along the eastern bank of Hickman Creek behind Smith's line, the rattle of musketry suddenly cuts through the otherwise calm winter evening to announce the first contact between the two armies. The stage is set when the USS Carondelet briefly announces the Union Navy's presence on the Cumberland River. Slowly, Smith's soldiers edge up a ridge closer to the rifle pits held by Buckner's division closest to the fort. McClernand's soldiers begin to march toward the right to reach the river above the town. With darkness descending over Fort Donelson, however, and lacking complete information on the situation, Grant's army soon settles down to await daylight when they can complete their encirclement of the Confederate force. That night, the Federals peer across the intervening ravines at the luminous campfires in the Confederates' armed camp beyond the earthworks. The Southerners are backed up against the Cumberland with avenues of escape fast disappearing. But the Rebs have come here to fight, not run. And down at the river, Lieutenant Colonel Milton Haynes keeps his water battery gunners at work, if only to boost morale for facing the dreaded Yankee gunboats the next day. On the river itself, two remaining steamboats left to Confederate service shuttle Floyd's Virginians in from Cumberland City amid flaming torches and cheering from the shoreline. When General Floyd arrives in person at dawn on Thursday, February 13th, he sets up headquarters in a picturesque hotel in Dover, near the upper steamboat landing, and assesses the situation. Two sharp infantry attacks and a naval bombardment marked the first day of fighting at the Battle of Fort Donelson, February 13th. This is seen as a test of Confederate strength and defenses, but not a pitched battle. All three of the actions begin in the morning and continue into the afternoon, set against a backdrop of continuous and crackling sharpshooter fire and occasional artillery bursts. General Smith and McClernand are to demonstrate but not attack the enemy. They almost immediately ignore these orders from Grant. The Army commander has also instructed Commander Henry Walk and the USS Carondelet to make a diversionary bombardment of the fort to enable the land forces to complete their encirclement. Walk draws heavy fire from Haney's water battery gunners without accomplishing much, but as the soldiers' slang of the day would have it, the ball was opened. As it turns out, the main land fights are of greatest interest to the Federals, since they indicate that Fort Donelson's investments might be more difficult than anticipated. The initial fight on February 13th begins on Brigadier General C.F. Smith's front as his 2nd Division tries to move closer to General Buckner's position on the Eddyville Road sector. No one has decent maps, and to uncover Confederate battery positions, Smith directs Battery D, 1st Missouri Artillery, to shell the rebel defenses. Then, after a hearty breakfast, the white-haired brigadier orders a simultaneous advance of Colonel John Cook's 3rd Brigade and Colonel Jacob G. Lawman's 4th Brigade. Out marches the enthusiastic Northerners in battle array, a clear violation of General Grant's orders not to bring on a major battle. A hot fire from the Southern defenders in the entrenchments also disorganizes Smith's movement. By late afternoon, Lawman and Cook have successfully extricated their men with a nasty firefight, leaving nearly 100 dead comrades on the hillside before Buckner's earthworks. The thrill of first battle is muted for both sides by sights and sounds of first casualties. Even Commander Walk's Carondelet and the water batteries suffer losses as a prominent Confederate gun captain is cut down by a screw tap loosened by the explosion of a Union shell, and one 128-pounder Confederate projectile knifes through the gunboat's side, skipping about like a wild animal, wounding several seamen with wood splinters and bursting a steam heater before dropping, still hissing, over the side of the ship and into the water. Young gunboat crewmen learn quickly that the ironclads offer no safe haven from the danger. Out in the woods, the redoubtable Nathan Bedford Forrest, just beginning to earn fame as one of the finest and toughest cavalry officers of the war, draws blood. Annoyed by one pesky marksman from the famed Burgess's Western sharpshooters, he has borrowed a Maynard rifle from one of his officers and shot the offender out of a tree. This young sharpshooter would be the first of many Yankees killed by Forrest in the war. Artillery fire also sounds that morning in McClernand's sector as his men undertake to march around Dover by the Wind Ferries and Pyrenees roads. Illinois cavalrymen first catch sight of the Cumberland as they mount Dudley's Hill, and they quickly draw fire from the Confederate entrenchments and artillery positions in that sector. One especially nettlesome battery, Captain Frank Manley's Tennessee Battery from Humphrey County, peppers McClernand's marching Federals with long-range fire. General McClernand determines to put an end to this impertinence. In defiance of Grant's instructions, once again, he sends a brigade crashing through the debris-clogged ravines against the main Confederate position in an attempt to silence the offending guns. Colonel William R. Morrison's 3rd Brigade makes the assault under the personal leadership of Colonel Isham N. Haney of the 48th Illinois, sweeping down from the Wind Ferry Road into Aaron Hollow in parade ground formation. The fight ends in 15 minutes. As with General Smith's reconnaissance in force, amity, accurate enemy fire, and poorly disciplined attackers in unfavorable terrain cuts the Haney-Morrison attack to ribbons. Another 150 Federal dead littered the hillside near the offending battery's position, but here, dry leaves catch fire during the fighting and threaten a cruel death to the wounded attackers. When the shooting ceases, humane Confederates leap from behind their works and rush out into no man's land to rescue their erstwhile enemies. Minutes later, the two sides are once again back to shooting one another. Both sides expect to see the gunboats attack Fort Donelson, for Grant has great faith that his friend Foote can win another striking victory as he had done at Fort Henry. Nevertheless, the flag officer is hesitant as a result of the punishment his flotilla had suffered in the earlier battle. So Grant orders Brigadier General Lew Wallace to bring reinforcements overland from the Tennessee River post and forms them into a 3rd Division, positioned between Smith and McClernand to cover the Indian Creek Valley sector. Grant's command is now approaching 21,000 men surrounding Dover as he waits impatiently for the gunboats to do something. Overnight, temperatures plummet to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and cold winds whip snow, sleet, and freezing rain against the soldiers huddled on both sides of the lines. Fires are forbidden for fear they will disclose positions to the enemy. Many young Union volunteers wish they had not so quickly discarded blankets and overcoats on the march from Fort Henry. Few units in either army are as blessed as Confederate Colonel Roger Hanson's 2nd Kentucky of Brigadier General Buckner's right wing with their hooded parkas. Many of the Southern comrades have to wrap themselves in old quilts and blankets and even cut up pieces of carpet to guard against the brutal weather. It was a night of great suffering and hardship, recalled one Union brigade commander. Neither army is especially ready to fight when a cold dawn emerges on Valentine's Day, February 14th. But Grant is up early and looking for action. He and his staff ride to the river at about 9 a.m. to consult with Foote aboard his flagship. Grant directs the newly arrived troops aboard the transport to leave their comfortable quarters and join the shivering soldiers surrounding Fort Donelson. Then he turns to Foote and persuades him that the gunboats might simply run by the water batteries and enfilade the rebel positions, thus forcing surrender. Foote wants to await the arrival of flatboats carrying heavy mortars to subdue the fort. Grant says no, declaring that the army needs support and that it is time to finish their work. The grumbling flag officer calls his boat captains together, gives them instructions about preparing for combat, and then turns to his battle plan. They will proceed as they had done at Fort Henry. The Confederate gunners, meanwhile, had remained at their guns at that frigid night, anticipating an advance by the gunboats under the cover of a stormy darkness. Occasionally, they fire a shot down the river just to annoy Foote's flotilla and the transports. Early on St. Valentine's Day, Captain Reuben Ross in the upper battery spots a large plume of smoke indicating something is afoot. He sends word to Floyd's headquarters, but the Confederate generals are busy with other matters, as Floyd indicates in a telegram to General Johnston, claiming he now faces 40,000 Yankees. "I will fight them this evening." Indeed, Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner intend a surprise foray to break the land siege. It takes time to muster the troops in position and, at the pivotal moment for the breakout attempt, the gunboats hover into view on the river. Flag Officer Foote's flotilla comes around a bend in a river at about 2 p.m. on February 14th, steaming against a flood tide of the muddy river. It takes a half hour to close with the water batteries. The City Series ironclads USS St. Louis, Louisville, Pittsburgh, and Carondelet lead the van, steaming abreast as at Fort Henry. Then comes the timberclads USS Tyler and Conestoga, about 1/4 mile in the rear. Meanwhile, Captain Ross sends some shots toward the Union transports, scattering them after they had landed their human cargoes. He then turns his battery on the gunboats, which had opened fire about 1.5 miles from the batteries. As the craft moves to point-blank range, they suffer cruel punishment from Ross and his heavy guns. The rebel gunners have carefully plotted ranges by marking on trees along the riverbank, and they have devised special sighting devices on their cannons. Floodwaters had already swept a barricade of floating trees some 900 yards from the batteries. It is up to the water batteries to save the day on their own. The naval action at Fort Donelson assumes a different cast from that at Fort Henry as Foote closes to within 450 yards of the batteries shortly after mid-afternoon. These batteries are more elevated above the water than Fort Henry's row of guns, and the plunging fire from the 2 water batteries at Fort Donelson soon finds the gunboat's vulnerability. They rake the craft fore and aft with shot and shell. Before long, all but the gunboat Carondelet are drifting back downstream in defeat. During the artillery exchange, Flag Officer Foote is wounded, ironically in the foot. His flagship, USS St. Louis, has been reduced to shambles during the exchange. Shivering Confederates all over Fort Donelson's perimeter take up cries of victory. They had not expected to beat the gunboats as, at one point, an excited Nathan Bedford Forrest shouted to an aide, "Parson, for God's sake, pray. Nothing but Almighty God can save that fort." The inexperienced Confederate gunners have achieved an astonishing 50% hit record on the gunboats. The humiliated naval officer counts 54 dead or dying among his severely battered craft. As another harsh winter night settles over the gloomy Union besiegers, they listen to the celebrations across the Confederate lines. It is the Confederacy's greatest triumph at Fort Donelson, and Grant is anything but sanguine about prospects for a quick victory. He will let the Navy make its own excuses for defeat, but he writes to his wife, Julia, that night that the taking of Fort Donelson bids fair to be a long job. The moment of decision had arrived for the Confederacy in the West. Announcement of the Confederate triumph flashes over telegraph wires to Johnston, countering earlier predictions of a dire defeat at the hands of the dreaded gunboats. Johnston wires back to Floyd, "If you lose the fort, bring your troops to Nashville if possible." But with victory seemingly in their grasp, the brigadiers hesitate about their next step. General Floyd convenes a council of war at which the participants determine whether to continue the battle or fight their way out of the Federal trap. Pillow wants to remain. Floyd and Buckner prefer to get out under the cover of a surprise attack the next morning. Details of the scheme are murky. Pillow understands that when the avenue of escape opens, the troops would return to the rifle pits to secure baggage, artillery, rations, the water battery gunners, and other troops. On the other hand, Buckner thinks that the attackers will keep going once they had breached the Union lines. There would be no turning back. Gunners, supplies, and excess personnel would be left to their fate, with nothing truly resolved except that they would attack in the morning. Brigadier General Bushrod Johnson, for one, departs the meeting gloomier and more anxious than before. Just as Foote's appearance has disrupted Confederate plans that afternoon, the unexpected victory at the water batteries confuses the Southern generals as to the urgency of leaving or fighting on. At any rate, the troops gather for the massive Confederate assault scheduled for daybreak on Saturday, February 15th. Lumbering into position during the winter night, snow and wind muffles the sounds of movement. None of the Federals detect the shifting columns. Buckner's men withdraw from their entrenchments, leaving only a single regiment of 450 men armed with shotguns to face Smith's whole division. Delays prove inevitable. However, as wary soldiers navigate slick roads, Buckner's force is still not in position when Generals Pillow and Johnson start their attack at 6 a.m. on February 15th. McClernand's cold and sleepy soldiers stumble out of their makeshift bivouacs as the first warning shots and sounds of the infamous rebel yell break the cold morning air. The big push to flee starvation, Yankee prison camps, and the stigma of surrender has begun. General Pillow would style it the Battle of Dover. The snow, underbrush, and tactical inexperience further delays any quick resolution. The fighting turns into a slugfest between the Confederates' heavy attack columns and McClernand's thin line of defenders in the vicinity of the Forge and Wind Ferry roads. At 8 a.m., however, the Federals are in trouble as fighting envelops the country lanes and ravines and blood-stained snow-marked points of contact between the two battle lines. Forrest's cavalry troopers dislodge a stubborn Union field battery, and the Confederate infantry slowly bend McClernand's 1st Division back under heavy pressure. As the young Union soldiers expend their ammunition, they simply drop out of line, holding their empty cartridge boxes aloft, and begin a slowly withdrawal. McClernand sends couriers to Lew Wallace's command post for help, but the Indiana general hesitates to act without Grant's instructions. Somehow, the Army commander has disappeared. Earlier that morning, Grant had ridden once more with the wounded and humbled Foote aboard his gunboat. Headquarters aides do not know what to do in their leader's absence, and the intervening woods hide the sounds of the unfolding battle from the command conferences at the river. Thus, by noon, Pillow and Johnson have carried Confederate fortunes to the brink of success. Avidly, Federal defeat was caused mostly by fatigue, supply shortages, and inept defensive moves, not by any lack of pluck or valor. Nonetheless, McClernand's division had been beaten back from its position. The attackers are unable to finish their task. By early afternoon, the relentless drive of Pillow and Johnson, now supported by Buckner, had gained the objective. The Federals had been driven back from the Forge Road and westward along the Winds Ferry Road toward Fort Henry. 2 of McClernand's 3 front-line brigades have been crumpled, and the 3rd is being forced into precipitous retreat. Still, another brigade is crushed as it rushes from reserve. At that hour, the way out of the Fort Donelson trap is open to the Confederates. Stretched along a mile-long battle line, the soldiers are ready. Their leaders are not. During the subsequent 2 hours, the Confederate generals yield the initiative back to the enemy. A combination of circumstances snatches defeat from victory. General Wallace has finally taken the initiative and moves to a blocking position astride the Winds Ferry Road, where he stymies the Confederate attack. The rebel attackers run out of momentum, and General Pillow, according to his interpretation of the original plan, now orders everyone back to the trenches preparatory to evacuation. He also notices signs of a Federal attack on Buckner's weakly held position in the distance. Buckner, however, raises strong objection and questions Pillow's authority to change the plan. The two generals haggle while their soldiers mill around waiting for further orders. At this point, Floyd appears in between his 2 subordinates, and then finally orders all the troops back into the defensive perimeter. Just then, Grant returns to the field, finally found by anxious couriers. He had ridden hard over icy roads to reach the scene of catastrophe brewing on his right flank. Conferring with Generals McClernand and Wallace, Grant senses the crisis in the battle. Perhaps his own career has been reached. He sees McClernand's men standing in knots, talking excitedly with no officers giving directions. He also notices that the soldiers have their muskets but no ammunition, even though there's tons of it close at hand. Calling out to an aide to ride along the line with him, he shouts at the stunned troops, "Fill your cartridge boxes quick and get into line. The enemy is trying to escape and he must not be permitted to do so." This works like a charm. Grant also discerns from prisoners what is happening on the Confederate line, and that the victorious enemy might be just as demoralized as his own men. Whoever seizes the initiative at this point will achieve victory. Chomping down hard on an unlit cigar, he orders McClernand and Wallace simply, "Gentlemen, the position on the right must be retaken." He also sends word to Foote requesting a show of force from the gunboats. Grant's quick and determined leadership helps spring his soldiers into action, and they quickly stabilize their lines, pushing the Confederates back into their original defenses. The opportunity to escape was within reach of the Confederates, but now was lost to them. Nearly 1,000 soldiers on both sides are dead, with about 3,000 wounded still lying across the field. Some freeze to death in the brutal snowstorm. At 1:30 a.m. on February 16th, the Confederate generals hold a council of war at the Dover Hotel. Here, the generals decide it is time to surrender the fort and its army. Brigadier General Floyd, afraid that if captured, he would be indicted for corruption during his service as Secretary of War under President Buchanan, quickly turns his command over to General Pillow. However, Pillow also fears reprisals from the North if he were to be captured, and passes the command of Fort Donelson over to Buckner, who agrees to remain behind and surrender the army. Disgusted at the general show of cowardice, Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest announces, "I did not come here to surrender my command," and promptly storms out of the meeting. He proceeds to lead about 700 of his cavalrymen on their escape from the fort. They begin a long march through the snowstorm toward Nashville. Colonel Forrest will fight another day. General Buckner sends a message to General Grant asking for terms of surrender. Having helped Grant out of financial situations in his pre-war civilian life, Buckner was hoping that Grant would be merciful to the commander. However, the message he receives from Grant is that no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. He adds, "I propose to move immediately upon your works." Buckner agrees to Grant's unconditional surrender. Fort Donelson falls that day, February 16th, and its army is marched off to northern prison camps. The decisive victory at the Battle of Fort Donelson propels Ulysses S. Grant to national stardom, earning him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. It also earns him the attention of President Lincoln. Close to a third of General Johnston's forces are now prisoners. Grant had captured more soldiers than all previous American generals combined, and Johnston was now deprived of more than 12,000 soldiers he would later need in the battles to come. With his decisive victory at Fort Donelson, Grant is promoted by President Lincoln to the rank of Major General and given command over the newly formed Army of the Tennessee. With Forts Henry and Donelson now fallen, Grant can now launch an invasion further south along the Tennessee.